Mas vamos iniciar, então, essa mesa do primeiro seminário sobre tortura. É o primeiro painel, Medo e Tortura, Ética, Valores e Crueldade nos Dias Atuais. Nós vamos alterar um pouco a ordem, então vamos começar com o professor Yuval Ginbar. Ele é conselheiro legal da Anistia Internacional e conselheiro sênior do Comitê Público contra a Tortura em Israel. Há muitos anos tem se dedicado ao tema da tortura, mas na última década tem como particular interesse aprofundada discussão sobre a tortura e a luta contra o terrorismo. O seu trabalho tem contribuído tanto com os movimentos de defesa dos direitos humanos, como também para as discussões acadêmicas sobre o tema da tortura. Destaca-se nesse sentido sua última publicação, Why Not Torture Terrorists? Moral, Practical and Legal Aspects of Ticking Bomb Justification for Torture, previsto para ser lançado em março de 2008. Então, eu agradeço já antecipadamente a todos os participantes, ao público também, e convido, então, o professor a iniciar a sua exposição.
Bom dia a todos. Gostaria de agradecer. No, actually, I stick to English. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm very grateful for the organizers, for NEV, for São Paulo University, and for the sponsors for giving us this great opportunity to talk to you. I hope you've had a great, strong Brazilian coffee this morning, because we're going to jump straight into the deep philosophical end of a question which may be purely theoretical, but has had a serious impact on the real world in which we live. Is torturing just once ever justified? By just once, I'm talking about the kind of situation, the ticking bomb situation, which is at the heart of the attempts to erode the absolute legal, I guess, moral prohibition on torture in the war on terror post 9/11. So it basically has four components. One, a terrorist is caught who has just planted a powerful bomb that will soon explode and will kill tens, hundreds or thousands of innocent civilians. He would not disclose the information needed to thwart the attack unless he is tortured. If tortured, he will provide all the information and the attack can be thwarted and the lives can be saved. And torturing is the only way of doing so. But before discussing the question itself, I'll have to spend some time actually defending the posing of this question. So, is it ever justified to ask the ticking bomb question? Well, the answer is apparently no, according to the closest thing we have to a unified human rights NGO position vis-à-vis the ticking bomb issue. There is this publication, this wonderful publication, entitled Diffusing the Ticking Bomb Scenario, Why We Must Say No to Torture Always. It was published by the Association for the Prevention of Torture in Geneva, but it followed a consultation with the 8 leading human rights NGOs, including Dinah's organization, Human Rights Watch, and my organization, Amnesty International, and Jean Maria was also there among the experts, and so was I. But we're not signed up to it officially, so I guess it's okay to criticize. Here's what the back cover has to say. This scenario, the ticking bomb scenario, ultimately seeks to destroy the hard-won absolute prohibition of torture under international and national laws. In presenting certain acts of torture as justifiable, even desirable, in distorting reality and manipulating emotions and ethical reasoning, in leading well-intentioned societies down a slippery slope to legalized and systematic torture, the ticking bomb scenario represents a grave threat to global anti-torture efforts. So is the very evocation of the ticking bomb scenario tantamount to presenting torture as justifiable, even desirable? I beg to differ, albeit in a qualified way. I'm going to make 5 arguments why the tactic of diffusing the scenario is efficient but not sufficient and should be supplemented by confronting this scenario head-on. 1, it is right to question the motives of, let's say, most of those posing the ticking bomb question. Among them, you find a lot of states that do torture and personalities such as US Vice President Dick Cheney. But I believe it is wrong to do so in a sweeping way. The ticking bomb question is a legitimate moral, philosophical, theoretical question which, by stripping a situation to its bare essentials, tries to get to the heart of the moral dilemma that this question poses. As such, it far predates the war on terror. It is neither better nor worse than other philosophical scenarios you may have heard of, such as the trolley problem or the prisoner's dilemma. Of course, no self-respecting thinker would argue that a theoretical answer to such questions is easily, let alone automatically, translatable to real-life situations. And I'll go back to this later. 2, it is right to say that no state has tortured just once, and that all attempts to allow torture in limited circumstances only have resulted in the institutionalization of torture, in the corruption of law enforcement, judicial, medical, and other professions and systems. This is an extremely strong and valid argument, as it is concrete, practical, reality-based, and provable. It is similarly right and proper to argue that the same may happen in any future attempts. Make no mistake about my position, I think that this argument should be made. However, this is an empirical argument, and as such, it cannot be a conclusive one. When it comes to learning lessons from slippery slope disasters such as Abu Ghraib, an absolute prohibition on torturous interrogation techniques is just one option. Another is to put in place new or improved safeguards against quote-unquote unjustified torture, which it is argued will enable torturing only ticking bombers. These don't work? Well, let's try others, and there's no end to it. Proposed safeguards have so far included torture warrants by judges, approval of torture methods only at the highest military and political level. For instance, water torture, also known as waterboarding, must now apparently be approved by the President of the United States himself. There's an idea of or a system of approving torture only after the fact and more. So a great argument, but not a watertight or conclusive one. 3, there's a problem in claiming or implying, as the NGO document does, that once you've ridiculed the idea that anyone can know with 100% certainty that a ticking bomb situation exists, that is, that the terrorist knows where the bomb is, that he will talk if tortured, that he will give the necessary information, etc. Once you've debunked this 100% idea, you've won the argument. Humans can never be 100% sure of all the facts in any complex situation. Accepting actions as moral only where we have 100% certainty would render us all paralyzed. Let me give an acute example concerning a citizen of this country. On 22 July 2005, Jean-Charles de Menezes was shot dead by British police officers who had followed him to an underground train in South London. They believed he was a suicide bomber. They were extremely wrong. This was a horrible blunder. Lessons had to be learned. But nevertheless, no one has demanded that from then on, police should be prohibited from shooting in defense of the public unless they have absolutely 100% certainty about all the circumstances. Uncertainties, and with them a measure of slippery slope that can be very dangerous, especially in regards to powers granted to governments, are unavoidable. But this doesn't automatically render the granting of these powers wrong. 4, it can reasonably be claimed that, particularly in states facing frequent terrorist attacks, situations similar to a pure ticking bomb scenario have indeed taken place. And more importantly, that situations not amounting to 100% ticking bomb, but not departing from the pure scenario enough to change its basic moral contours, are possible. Israel, the country of my origin, for instance, has claimed that during essentially a 2-year period, it had encountered 90 cases of ticking bombs where they used physical measures of interrogation. That's the local euphemism for torture, which is allowed in such situations under a Supreme Court ruling. Is that impossible? Well, during that period, there were dozens of suicide bombings which killed hundreds of civilians. Dozens of additional suicide bombing attempts were thwarted, some of them we know, just hours or days before being carried out. There's a related practical problem here. How can we refute a government's claim that torture is inflicted only in ticking bomb situations or that torture saves lives? After all, it's the government that holds all the relevant information, which is usually confidential and legitimately so. But finally, my deepest concern is that it is not enough to opt overwhelmingly for attacking the motives of those posing the ticking bomb question, debunking the scenario itself, and pointing to slippery slope dangers that lurk in any acceptance of torturing just once, which are all relevant and crucial positions. Because unless, in addition, we actually face the ticking bomb question itself, we are giving up, without much fight, the core argument about the morality or the immorality of torture. Charles Krauthammer, a pro-torture US columnist, puts it this way. Even if the example I gave, the ticking bomb, were entirely hypothetical, the conclusion, yes, in this case even torture is permissible, is telling because it establishes the principle. Torture is not always impermissible. However rare the cases, there are circumstances in which, by any rational moral calculus, torture would not only be permissible, but would be required to acquire life-saving information. And once you've established the principle, to paraphrase George Bernard Shaw, all that's left to haggle about is the price. He's referring to a story, sort of sexist, about George Bernard Shaw, who met this beautiful woman. He propositioned her. She said no. He proposed to pay her £1 million. She said, okay, then. And then he said, how about £5? And she said, what kind of a woman do you think I am? And he said, we've established that. Now we're only negotiating the price. Now, Krauthammer is oversimplifying. It can be argued against him that even if this principle is established, the price may nevertheless be always too high for torture to be used in the real world. In other words, there can be made sound utilitarian reasons for an absolute prohibition of torture in the real world. However, I think he's right in pointing out that without taking a position on the core moral question, we are conceding ground and are reduced to essentially making second-order arguments about the price. What I'm advocating is something similar to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch's position on the death penalty. We say that its deterrence has not been proven. We say that mistakes may be made and innocent persons punished in this irrevocable way. We say that the death penalty tends to target the poor, the minorities, the socially or culturally marginalized. But we also say that we oppose it absolutely as a matter of principle. Even if a state may come up with solutions to all of the above problems, and prove that the death penalty can, in effect, deter criminals, we would still oppose it. I have to qualify my proposal, though, on practical level. I'm making a principled point, but it could be countered that the NGO position is much more likely to convince people in its present form than by adding my absolutist arguments. This is, again, an empirical issue which I'm not qualified to resolve, but the very fact that I couldn't quite convince even the participant in the seminar leading to that NGO document indicates that they may have a point. I'll briefly define two key concepts that will serve us from now on, staying away from gray areas. So let's define an act of terror or of terrorism as a willful attack deliberately targeting civilians, men, women, and children, in an effort to kill as many of them as possible to forward some political or ideological goal. What this goal is, independence, freedom, an Islamic state, a communist heaven, and whether or not this goal is in and of itself a worthy one is irrelevant here because we're considering the morality of the means rather than of the end. Torture, I'll use as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person, in this case, for the purpose of obtaining information. This definition is taken from the UN Convention Against Torture, but I've taken out the elements that are not crucial for our discussion. Okay, so let's play the torture justifier's game. Let's enter, for the sake of argument, a space where no doubts exist as to facts, and no long-term, society-wide, slippery slope dangers are looming. There are only two persons. One is you, me, or any other good person, in philosophers' parlance, a moral agent. The other is the terrorist who had planted that bomb, and we agree it's an evil act that should be prevented. I argue that you cannot justify torture in a ticking bomb situation without adopting an extreme, open-ended, utilitarian ethics, at least for extreme situations. And I will argue that this ethics is corruptive, enslaving, and would have a profound effect on how we view our normal, everyday world. We're talking about the morality of single acts against single persons in extreme situations. Okay, it's limited. The discussion is limited to that. Now, logically, you cannot justify torture without holding that no single act is so bad as to be always morally prohibited. Because simply, no single act is so bad as to be worse than torture. Rape, for instance, it's a form of torture. Murder, you can torture a person to death, but you'd still be torturing them. And why is it wrong, according to the torture-justifying view, to prohibit any act, any single act, small-scale act, absolutely? Because that would rule out resorting to these acts when they're necessary to prevent a horrendous catastrophe. It is the catastrophe, the quantitative immensity of bad results, which must be avoided, that justifies resorting to otherwise unacceptable acts. This is called a consequentialist or a utilitarian view, namely that the morality of acts is ultimately determined by their consequences. In our case, and again this is an extreme situation, the terrorist will suffer from being tortured, maybe the torturer will suffer, but compared to the massive deaths and the suffering of those wounded or surviving, if the bomb explodes, his torture is a price worth paying. Let's go to the opposite view. The opposite view is called absolutist. Now, absolutism brings to mind ruthless tyrants, the kind of zealot so-called pro-lifers who would prohibit a 12-year-old rape victim from taking the morning after pill, or the refusal of the Catholic Church to recommend the use of condoms in sub-Saharan Africa, even between spouses, as a means of slowing down the catastrophic spread of HIV/AIDS. In fact, one UK columnist wrote of Osama bin Laden and his army of medieval absolutists. In the same vein, those opposed to torture in a ticking bomb situation are often called fanatics. But what I'm proposing to counter the torture justifiers is only, I'll call it minimal absolutism. Minimal absolutism is a moral view that certain acts must be prohibited absolutely, whatever the consequences. Logically, it is the narrowest form of rejecting the view that any or all acts may be justified to prevent disastrous catastrophes. Let me put it in mathematical terms. The pro-torture or anti-absolutists say that 0 acts must never be performed. Okay? No act can be absolutely prohibited. The minimal absolutists say that 1 or more acts must never be performed. That's all. No categorical imperative, no lists of deadly sins, no framework for absolute prohibitions, just the claim that there must be at least one. All you have to do to establish the validity of minimal absolutism is to refute the anti-absolutist, torture-justifying, never-say-never view. Let me start this with an example of the absurdity of the pro-torture position. A philosopher named Judith Jarvis Thompson once gave the example of torturing babies to death for fun. Surely, she said, that must always be wrong, whatever the circumstances. But those who reject absolutism cannot say this without compromising their position. They must argue that in pure theory, and we are in the realm of pure theory, and in order to avoid a horrendous catastrophe, the possibility of justifying the torture to death for fun of one baby must be kept open. Let me now concoct a scenario and apologize for using this horrible example. What if we say that the torture of a baby to death for fun is broadcast live on the internet, and 300,000 murderous pedophiles all around the globe will watch it on the net? Now, at least 1% of them, that's 3,000, will actually cancel plans to go out and abduct and torture babies, preferring to stay home in front of their computer screens and enjoy the torture vicariously and safely. So that thousands of children will be saved from torture and death by the torture and the death of that single baby. Surely this makes it morally justifiable under the pro-torture view. Two obvious counter-arguments. One is that this is an absurd scenario. It most certainly is. But remember what Krauthammer said. Even if the example were entirely hypothetical, it establishes the principle. And this works both ways. The principle hereby established is that anti-absolutists cannot escape from justifying in pure theory the torture of babies to death for fun. But what about the fact that the terrorist is an evil person? He's responsible for the situation, whereas the baby is as innocent as a human can be. Now, considerations of responsibility and innocence will feature in every moral reasoning, including the utilitarian ones. But the idea that ultimately, in extreme circumstances, consequences determine the morality of an act is the equivalent of a moral tsunami. It washes everything before it. The other 3,000 babies are just as innocent, right? So if we're counting numbers, why should we prefer one innocent baby over the thousands? This is why several honest pro-torture thinkers have conceded that in very extreme ticking bomb scenarios, they would allow the torturing, say, of the terrorist's daughter if this is the only way to make him talk. You cannot prohibit torturing babies or other innocents at all times, at least not in pure theoretical morality, if you adhere to a never say never extreme utilitarian view. Only absolutists can say we would not allow the willful harm to the innocent. Never, full stop. And this is why I argue that the torture justifying view is morally corrupting. A principled anti-absolutist must admit every single act, including the worst atrocities imaginable on a small scale, into his or her moral considerations. Most of us may want to steer away from a person who weighs the pros and cons of torturing our children, murdering our parents, raping our partners and the like. We may find the very thought processes revolting, if not threatening, and we may find their insistence that this is only a purely theoretical principle, less than reassuring. And the torture justifying morality of extreme situations is enslaving, because what a moral agent must do under this view to determine what is right and what is wrong can in effect be done by a pocket calculator, not even a computer. It is frequently said that torture is an act of instrumentalizing, of turning its victim into a mere tool. Professor Celso Lafare actually made that point yesterday. This is true, of course, but it is often overlooked that the morality that justifies torture turns the torturer himself into a tool, an automaton devoid of free will, a total slave to circumstances and consequences. But let's set aside catastrophes and terrorists for a second and consider the impact of anti-absolutism on everyday life. Let's suppose you're a father. I've chosen a gender on purpose, and you have a 7-year-old son, and he has been told about another father who punished his 8-year-old child by beating him severely. Now, you've never beaten your child, but he apparently believes that this has to do with reaching the age of 8. So he asks you apprehensively, "You won't ever do this to me, Dad, will you?" Now, a minimal absolutist parent would have no trouble whatsoever in answering the child, "No, I'll never ever do this to you, no matter what." On the other hand, the never say never father, if he is truthful, would have to respond with something like, "I would only do this to you under the most extreme circumstances," and add quickly that such circumstances would be so extreme as to be almost purely theoretical. Somehow, even with this added clarification, it doesn't strike me as having quite the same reassuring effect on the child. He now feels, actually knows, that his father has in himself the capacity, propensity, even readiness, however theoretical, for punitive violence against him. Now, who actually is the fanatic in this scenario? Of course, the anti-absolutist father could simply lie to his son. However, the choice between lying to your children about your basic moral beliefs and leaving them unsure as to whether or not they are safe 100% from your punitive violence must worry any parent. This is another element of the debate that is often overlooked. Taking a position on these ostensibly academic, theoretical issues affects our everyday lives. If you come out of this seminar believing that torture is sometimes justified in pure theory, then you don't consider any single human act whatsoever to be intrinsically atrocious, despicable, unworthy of humans. Kidnapping, deportation, forced starvation, murder, rape, you cannot condemn any of them in principle, only within a given context where no justification can be provided. Of course, the exempting context may be found in 99.999% of the cases you face, but it's not quite the same. To be totally honest with your never say never view, and until you possess 100% of the facts, you'd have to condemn, for instance, all these cases of unjustified rape in Darfur, or say, my neighbor was arrested, shackled, and then unjustifiably beaten by police, or, of course, Abu Ghraib was a terrible case of unjustified torture. To counter further the minimal absolutist, the idea that minimal absolutism is fanatical, I'll give one example instead of the two I intended, where minimal absolutism, far from being practiced only by zealots in monasteries or whatever, is practiced by fairly civilized states and even by international community as a whole. This is about the search for a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. As you know, this pandemic has killed more than 25 million people so far and is killing about 2.1 million annually, of which 14,000 die in this country. The HIV/AIDS pandemic can be eradicated if a vaccine is found, but this is proving tricky. But we can imagine a shortcut. Professor Shu spoke of shortcuts yesterday. What if we start experimenting or testing new vaccines straight on humans instead of the cumbersome process of testing animals, then adaptation and readaptation to humans? By experimenting on, say, convicted murderers, rapists, indeed terrorists, we can probably wipe off years of the period it would take to find a vaccine. Even if, say, we expedite the process only by 100 days, at the current rate of deaths, we would save the lives of more than 500,000 people. Now, that's more than a nuclear ticking bomb in some of the imaginary scenarios that they throw at us. And yet there is a consensus among states, even states on whom HIV/AIDS has had a devastating effect, and among communities, even communities where HIV/AIDS is rampant. A consensus around requiring always and without exception informed consent from those participating in any medical experiments. So even in the face of an actual, not imagined, horrendous catastrophe, whose daily toll is much higher than that of 9/11, the international community sticks to a minimal absolutist prohibition and has chosen to suffer those horrendous consequences rather than to shed off its humanity. So, if I've convinced you that even in pure theory, minimal absolutism makes more moral sense than the anti-absolutist view, without which there can be no justification for torture, then the following logical construction applies. If A, anti-absolutism is rejected, therefore necessarily there must be at least one type of act that no human being may ever carry out upon another, and B, justifying torture is licensing one human being to carry out absolutely any act upon another, it follows inevitably, C, that torture is a type of act that one human being may never carry out upon another. I'll end by illustrating the evil that torture and justifying torture involve through the words of one torture victim, one torturer, and finally one terrorist. Here's part of a testimony of Dr. Jamal Amer, a Palestinian interrogating by the Israeli Security Service, which I took a long time ago. It also exemplifies the horrors of techniques which some governments absurdly claim are milder and therefore don't even constitute torture. He says, on the floor was a pile of stinking sacks. Behind them, a large plastic bag containing garbage. The policeman released one hand and held the handcuffs. He told me to pick up a sack from the floor. I took a sack and he yelled at me to put the sack on my head. I have a big head and it was very tight. In addition, the sack was made of material like army fatigues, but the part that was on the crown of the head was of some other material, harder and restricting. The sack is a dreadful thing. There is nothing worse. Better to be beaten for 24 hours than to have the sack on you. The sack is narrow and difficult to breathe. You sweat and the sweat trickles over your entire body. 3 fluids combine on your body: sweat, snot from your nose, and saliva from your mouth, and your hands are not free to wipe them away. And of course the sack is used by one prisoner after another. I never received a clean one. Once the sack was particularly dreadful. I'm 100% that it had been in the toilet, for there was a smell of excrement. I asked the guard to give me another sack. His response was like that of the interrogators. He beat me and kicked me and said, "What, you think I'm your servant?" and went on to curse me using language I cannot repeat. He refused to change the sack. Now here's the words of Eric Fair, who worked as a U.S. interrogator in Iraq in 2004. He says, "The lead interrogator had given me specific instructions. I was to deprive the detainee of sleep during my 12-hour shifts by opening his cell every hour, forcing him to stand in a corner and stripping him of his clothes. 3 years later, the tables have turned. It is rare that I sleep through the night without a visit from this man. His memory harasses me as I once harassed him. I failed to disobey a meritless order. I failed to protect a prisoner in my custody, and I failed to uphold the standards of human decency. Instead, I intimidated, degraded, and humiliated a man who could not defend himself. I compromised my values. I will never forgive myself." Finally, let me quote a terrorist, a mega-terrorist, Mr. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the self-confessed mastermind of the 9/11 atrocities. This is what Mr. Mohammed said to the Combatant Status Review Tribunal in Guantanamo in March of last year. He spoke in very broken English, but I think his justification of his action is very relevant here. This is what he says: "I don't like to kill people. I feel very sorry they have been killed kids in 9/11. I know American people are torturing from the 70s. Now there's a part that's redacted. He goes on to say, "I know they're talking about human rights, and I know it is against American Constitution, against American laws. But they said every law, they have exceptions. This is your bad luck. You've been part of the exception to our laws." So unless we're sure that some laws, those protecting fundamental human rights, such as freedom from torture, have no exceptions whatsoever, neither in theory nor in practice, we are adopting, to that extent, the terrorist morality of the end justifying the means. I therefore have a simple conclusion and recommendation as to what each of us should do in a ticking bomb situation when we hold a knowledgeable prisoner who will not talk and innocent lives are at risk. And this is what we should demand that our neighbor, our government, our courts and legislature, our liberation movement, if that's relevant, our international community must do in such a situation. They or we must do everything humanly possible to save the lives at risk, which means doing everything in our power that does not involve losing our own humanity, which means, in turn, never to torture or otherwise ill-treat another human being, whatever the circumstances. Obrigado.